For most of PlayStation's existence, they have been on top of the gaming world, consistently outselling their competition and frequently having the most popular console of each generation. PlayStation hasn't spent a lot of time at the bottom. That is, besides the PlayStation 3 generation. This was a rocky console for Sony, filled with incredible highs and even more incredible lows. The PlayStation 3 is often seen as PlayStation's biggest failure, and in most ways it was. The PS3 was overshadowed by its main competitor, the Xbox 360, for most of its life cycle, and generally, most people online remember the 360 much more fondly, with that console seeming to have a much bigger cultural impact. It's pretty widely agreed that the Xbox 360 won that battle, but would you believe me if I said the PlayStation 3 actually outsold the Xbox 360? It's a fact that not many realize, primarily since the 360 was ahead for so long. So how did this happen? How did a console that was in last place for most of its life cycle end up passing its biggest competitor at the last second? This is how to save a console. In many ways, the story of PlayStation 3 is a story of ego and hubris. Sony was coming off the PlayStation 2, the best-selling video game console of all time. The PlayStation 2 was such a smash hit that it really didn't even matter what the other console manufacturers were doing, but I do think that's a big part of the story here, because while Sony was raking in cash like it was nothing, all of their competition was struggling. Nintendo's GameCube was their least popular home console they had released up until that point. Sega's Dreamcast was such a colossal flop that they had to drop out of the console space entirely and become just a third-party developer. Meanwhile, Microsoft had joined the console market with Xbox, and while their sales were very respectable for a newcomer, it had nothing on the PlayStation 2. As Sony geared up for development of PlayStation 3, they understandably felt like they had nothing to lose, but that mindset led them down the wrong path. The PlayStation 3 first began development in 2001 under Ken Kutaragi. The console had set out with two primary goals in mind. One would be a focus on the Cell processor. This new processor promised to be the most powerful chip ever, being marketed as a supercomputer in your console. On paper, the Cell processor had a lot of advantages. This processor was going to allow for new games and new possibilities that were never before thought possible, and it was said to be incredibly difficult to hack. Swayed by these selling points, Sony bit hard on this tech and made it the entire foundation of its new console. But this chip proved troublesome immediately. When dev kits started going out, developers quickly complained of how difficult it was to work with. It was incredibly complicated compared to previous CPUs developers had been working with. And even more damaging was that it was incredibly difficult compared to Microsoft's new console, the Xbox 360, but more on that later. Unfortunately, by the time these concerns came to light, it was way too late for Sony to make a significant enough change, and developers absolutely hated the PlayStation 3. Another feature that Sony banked on for PlayStation 3 was Blu-ray. Blu-ray was still new at the time, offering the ability to play HD video for the first time. Sony making PS3 compatible with Blu-ray was a no-brainer, considering the success of the PS2 and its abilities to play DVDs. The PS2 being able to play DVDs was one of the primary reasons for its meteoric success. Many saw it as a great deal, getting a DVD player and a video game console in one box. Sony was attempting to replicate this with Blu-ray and the PS3. However, I feel like this didn't work out quite as well. In the case of the PS2, DVDs had already been widely accepted at that time, whereas Blu-rays were still very new at the time of the PlayStation 3. You gotta remember, this was the first console generation to even have HD capabilities, so a lot of people in 2005 or 2006 didn't even have HD TVs to begin with, much less a need for a Blu-ray player. So in the end, I think Sony was just a little ahead of the times with this feature. Usually, I would say forward thinking is a good thing, and ultimately Blu-ray did become very popular and helped the PS3 later in the life cycle. But at the beginning, this was a feature that the general consumer wasn't necessarily interested in, and it raised the price of the PS3 significantly. And that initial starting price is a big part of our story. So with that, I think it's time to get into Sony's E3 2006 press conference. If you're a longtime PlayStation fan, the mention of E3 2006 probably sends shivers down your spine. In one of the all-time worst E3 press conferences, Sony attempted to sell consumers on PlayStation 3 before its upcoming release at the end of the year. What ensued over the next 2 hours was a showcase so awful, so embarrassing, and so meme-worthy that it changed the entire gaming landscape. Somehow, in just 2 hours, PlayStation went from gaming powerhouse to laughingstock. It was a perfect storm of things in and out of Sony's Sony's control that all combined into a massive disaster. Now, I knew this conference was bad, but watching it back now was truly shocking. And here we get some of the most well-known memes in gaming with Ridge Racer and a giant enemy crab. While these two moments could just be seen as funny memes, I think they perfectly encapsulate what was so horrific about this conference. Everything about this conference seemed out of sorts. It almost seemed like they weren't prepared. Let's use the giant enemy crab as an example. For those who don't know the origin, it comes from the gameplay showcase for a fairly obscure PS3 launch title called Genji Days of the Blade. You might be wondering what's so bad about showing a giant enemy crab anyways. Well, 2 minutes earlier, they specifically made a point to mention that the game would be based on history and would feature, and I quote, famous battles that actually took place in ancient Japan. So yeah, I can see why people took issue with this. The weirdest part about it is that this was so easily avoidable. Why even say something like that if the game isn't going for history or realism at all? And it certainly didn't help that the person showcasing the game on stage then fumbled around for a minute trying to get the crab to do what he needed it to do. Now, some of this strangeness is normal for an early E3 press conference. E3 press conferences weren't always supposed to be massive marketing events. They were initially only meant to be presentations for media members. But still though, the awkwardness that radiated throughout this press conference was a lot, even for the early E3 standards. Sony put out weird energy here, an energy that came across as nervous and anxious. It felt like they weren't confident in what they were showing, and that's a pretty strange vibe to give off as the company comes off the heels of the most dominant console generation in gaming history. Perhaps all that nervousness and anxious energy was leading up to the announcement that would define a generation: the price of the PlayStation 3. $599 is a quote that will forever live in gaming infamy. Ridge Racer and Giant Enemy Crab were just funny little flubs, but $599, that was enough to change the entire gaming world as we knew it. It really is crazy to look back and think about a console costing $600 in 2006. It's insane, especially when you consider each PlayStation iteration that has followed the PS3 has been cheaper. Even with the way inflation and cost of goods has risen over the last 20 years, the launch PS3 is still the most expensive console Sony has ever released. This price point was shocking to consumers, and what made it even worse was the fact that it came off the heels of a terrible presentation. If Sony had really wowed people with their E3 showcase, consumers may have been able to accept such a high price, but to drop that number at the end of such a disastrous showing was a massive mistake. Sony was certainly not doing themselves any favors here, but part of the reason why this announcement stung even more was because of what the other console manufacturers were offering. Nintendo was gearing up to release the Wii, which would go on to revolutionize gaming with its motion controls. With the Wii being much more family-oriented and having a price of just $250, Nintendo all but guaranteed they would control the casual gaming market. While we're on the topic of the Wii, I want to make a point here. In terms of console sales, the Wii won this generation and it wasn't even close. However, throughout the rest of this video, you probably won't hear me mention it much. The reason for this is simply because the Wii was really not the PS3's competitor in my eyes. They cornered completely different markets of the gaming world and for the most part had very little overlap. So while the Wii was a PS3 competitor in the sense that they were the current consoles on the market, I don't think the Wii was really a concern for Sony. The console that Sony did have to worry about, and the console that we'll be focusing on going forward throughout this video, is the Xbox 360 from Microsoft. The Xbox 360 got off to an early start this generation, being released a year earlier in 2005. The 360 didn't get off to the best start either, suffering from supply chain issues and systems overheating. But despite the negatives, the 360 had two major things going for it. The first was of course the price. The 360 launched with two different versions, one being sold for $299 and the other being sold for $399. On top of that, the 360 was a breeze for developers to make games for. This helped Microsoft land some exclusive games, and even for the games that weren't exclusive, the 360 version was almost always better than the PS3 version. Look no further than Bethesda's games during this generation for proof of this. With the 360 offering more for less, it's no surprise that the PS3 fell into such an early deficit during this generation. The PS3's launch initially started out pretty decently. As is customary for new consoles, all the diehards come out in droves to buy up the new systems as soon as they can. Because of this, the PS3 had a great first week, becoming the fastest selling home console in the United Kingdom, with 165,000 units sold in just 2 days. However, the console quickly started to fall off. In the week following launch, PS3 sales were reportedly down 82%. It pretty much seemed like after the PlayStation diehards got their consoles, no one else was interested. did. This downward trend continued for the next few years as developers struggled to get out meaningful games. PlayStation had some good things in the works, such as Uncharted Drake's Fortune, but many of their games would not be ready until late 2007. In the meantime, third-party games were consistently missing their PS3 deadlines due to the difficulties of the cell infrastructure. This led to huge games such as The Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion launching a full year late on PlayStation 3. But even worse than that was the fact that the third-party games that were releasing on time were in terrible shape. Games like Fallout 3 and Bayonetta may have been there day one on PS3, but they were the worst versions by far. As we moved throughout the early days of the PS3, the Xbox 360 dominated. Because on top of the 360 getting the best version of nearly every third-party game, Xbox was dropping banger exclusives. In 2006, Xbox had released Gears of War, a smash hit game that would become a premier franchise for them. And then in 2007, one of the most highly anticipated games ever was released with Halo 3. In my opinion, Halo 3 is one of the most impactful video games of all time. It was a cultural event when it was released in September 2007. Everyone wanted that game. No, everyone needed that game. And it helped push the 360's lead even further. PlayStation was finally starting to get some relevant exclusives out in 2007, such as Ratchet & Clank Tools of Destruction, but it just really couldn't compete with what Xbox was putting out there. 2009 was a damn good year for the PlayStation 3. The Slim model was released alongside a major price cut. The 80GB Slim model would retail for just $299, half the price that the PS3 had originally launched for. Alongside this great new model and much more attractive price came some very high-profile first-party games. 2009 saw the release of some of the most highly regarded and beloved games of the generation, including Infamous, Killzone 2, and Demon's Souls. And of course, the biggest game of them all was Uncharted 2 Among Thieves. Uncharted 2 was mind-blowing. It had graphics like we had never seen before, and what was even more impressive was how well the game ran and played. The set pieces present in this game were jaw-dropping, with so many moments that made you feel like you were playing a movie. Naughty Dog had found a way to crack the code, and really unlocked PS3 and its capabilities for the first time. Uncharted 2 is a showcase of everything Sony had hoped PS3 could be, and it was proof that despite the development difficulties present, it could all be worth it in the end if done right. The Slim model, price drop, and Uncharted 2 all came just a few months before the holiday season of 2009, giving PS3 a major boost. Meanwhile, the Xbox 360 was starting to show some cracks, with the infamous Red Ring of Death wreaking havoc on consoles everywhere. Almost everyone who owned an early 360 has a story with the Red Ring of Death, and whether they got their consoles repaired, replaced for free, or had to buy a new one entirely, patience was starting to wear thin. For some 360 users who were gearing up to buy their third or fourth console, the newly cheap PS3 was starting to look quite intriguing. In 2009, PS3 console sales were almost on par with the 360, which was a huge win. According to NPD, PS3 console sales were now only a few 100,000 behind. Things were finally starting to look up for Sony and PlayStation 3, but unfortunately, a major setback was coming. Everything seemed to be going right for Sony and the PlayStation 3. They were gaining a lot of momentum and were finally starting to catch up to the Xbox 360. But then all of that changed on April 17, 2011. A hacking group was able to get into Sony's network services, exposing the personal data of over 70 million users. As a result of this hack, Sony was forced to disable PlayStation Network services on April 20, 2011. What ensued over the next 24 days was a catastrophic disaster. It became one of the biggest news stories in the world, with the media constantly pressing Sony on how this could have happened, and why they waited so long to warn their users. PSN users had to worry about whether their data had been stolen, including very sensitive information such as their address, date of birth, credit card info, and more. Meanwhile, throughout all of this mayhem, Sony's players are left sitting there in the dark with no real timetable for a return. Initially, when Sony took down the PSN servers, they said it would take a day or two, but then the servers were down for 24 days. I hope you all realize how certifiably insane that is. Nowadays, if a game's servers are down for like a day, that would be considered a long time. So now imagine PSN servers being down for nearly a month. Amidst the outage on May 1st, 2011, Sony's leadership team held a press conference where they asked for forgiveness and bowed their heads. It is a deeply powerful image and one that represents just how far this once untouchable brand had fallen. Sony was finally able to get the servers back up on May 14th, 2011 and offered free PS Plus subscriptions and free games as an apology. This PSN outage came at a very bad time for the PlayStation 3. The momentum they had gained was gone, and after all the work they had done to restore PlayStation's image, it had become tainted once again. It's really a shame the PSN outage came when it did, because 2011 was actually a stacked year for PS3 software, seeing huge first-party releases with Uncharted 3, Little Big Planet 2, Resistance 3, Infamous 2, and Killzone 3. Ultimately, this high level of first-party output was able to keep the PS3 on track, despite the horrors that had taken place earlier in the year. 2011 was not kind to the PS3, but surprisingly, Sony didn't actually lose much ground here, as the other console manufacturers were struggling a bit as well. The Nintendo Wii was on its last legs. Despite being the best-selling console of this generation by a large margin, the Wii had a major issue. Software sales for the console were horrific, with many people no longer engaging with the Wiis they had bought. In the 2010s, it felt like basically every person owned a Wii. Any home you walked into had a Wii sitting on the TV stand. But the problem was, no one ever really used them, and if they did, they just played Wii Sports or whatever other few games they had picked up along the way. The Wii's casual audience was great for large console sales, but it wasn't great for keeping consumers engaged. As game output for Wii started slowing down immensely, it forced people who were engaged with gaming to look elsewhere. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of Wii owners who were tired of the shovelware and lackluster game output started to migrate over to PS3 around this time. Meanwhile, Microsoft was going down a bit of a strange path with the Xbox 360. In 2010, they introduced Kinect. This motion sensor device hoped to capitalize on the casual audience in the way that the Wii had. Obviously, Microsoft saw how well the Wii was selling and wanted a piece of that pie. Sony did it too with PlayStation Move, but I feel like Xbox's push for Kinect was a lot stronger than Sony's push for PlayStation Move. For example, Xbox spent a third of its E3 2011 showcase talking about Kinect. The Kinect did sell very well, but I feel like Xbox alienated some of the more hardcore gaming audience with this initiative. Obviously, Xbox was still putting out the games you would expect, like Halo, Forza, and Gears, but their push for Kinect in the early 2010s was very off-putting for a lot of gamers. So once again, I wouldn't be surprised if some consumers jumped ship over to the PS3 around this time. And for customers who were looking to join this console generation late, the PS3 had become a very attractive option. Ultimately, what carried the PS3 was their extremely strong finish to the generation. While the Wii and 360 limped to the finish line, Sony continued to put out unparalleled experiences. The best example of this is, of course, The Last of Us in 2013. The Last of Us is highly regarded as one of the best video games of all time, and was seen as an absolute must-play. This boost from The Last of Us hype combined with the cheaper-than-ever cost of the PS3 was the last push it needed to surpass the Xbox 360 in lifetime sales. Now, I will admit, it has been debated whether the PS3 actually outsold the 360, but at the absolute very least, Sony was able to catch up and match 360 sales. And that, in and of itself, was a major win. There were times throughout this generation when it looked like the PlayStation brand would never be the same. There were times when fans genuinely wondered if there would even be another PlayStation with the way the Xbox 360 was able to dominate gaming culture and the gaming world at large. But yet, at the very last second, the PS3 was able to sell just as well as its dreaded competitor. So how did this happen? I would say the primary way Sony was able to save the PlayStation 3 was by releasing consistent, high-quality exclusive games that you couldn't find anywhere else. Their dedication to sticking with what made their console great, instead of following trends set by competitors, was highly successful. As the generation went on, developers learned how to correctly use PS3's architecture and were able to put out experiences we once never thought possible. Right around that same time, when games were hitting their stride, the PS3 price was cut dramatically. Everything fell into place at the perfect time. Sony was thoroughly humbled throughout this generation. Whether it was the poor launch reception, the PSN outage, or the general dominance of their competitors, Sony had to dig deep and put their absolute best foot forward at all times. And what that gave us was a motivated PlayStation. And a motivated PlayStation is a great PlayStation, always trying to push the industry forward and give their players the absolute best experiences possible. This underdog mentality is the reason why Sony was able to recover and have such a great last-second surge to save the PlayStation 3. When I look at PlayStation today, I can start to see some of the signs of the once big-headed company that thought they were untouchable. With Xbox slowly creeping towards third-party development, and with Nintendo once again thriving in a market much different than Sony's, I can only hope that PlayStation does not start to make the same mistakes as they did early on in the PS3 generation. There's a lot to learn from the PS3 story, and I think any console manufacturers would do well to reference this console's history anytime they're getting ready to release a new product on the market. I hope you enjoy this episode of How to Save a Console. If you did enjoy it, let me know by leaving a like and subscribing. I think the next episode of this series will be our first variant of the show, known as How Not to Save a Console, where we dissect a console that wasn't so fortunate. Let me know which systems you would like to see me cover next in the comments below.